The assumption that Moscow is deliberately holding back a massive, well-equipped conventional reserve force, waiting for the perfect moment to launch a sweeping, war-winning offensive, is a persistent analytical blind spot in modern strategy. An objective assessment of the 2026 data shows that the Russian Federation is operating at its absolute kinetic, economic, and logistical limits. A large-scale mechanized breakthrough is physically impossible to execute. The expectation of rapid maneuver warfare has collided with a front line where Russian forces advance at a glacial 15 to 70 meters per day. To understand why these limitations are permanent, we have to examine the specific geopolitical, economic, and technological factors that are actively strangling Russian force generation. Anticipating a decisive breakthrough requires ignoring the weight of Clausewitzian friction. The military machine required for that operation no longer exists. Traditional battlefield friction, the mud and the weather, has been supplanted by a far, far more lethal barrier: digital sensor density. The battlefield is completely transparent. Navigating this environment extracts a catastrophic toll. Since February 2022, the Russian military has suffered nearly 1.2 million casualties. Shifting geopolitical realities also prevent Russia from concentrating its total military apparatus in the Ukrainian theater, as a vast portion of their remaining assets is locked down elsewhere. Internally, economic starvation has hollowed out the domestic defense industry. Russian commanders are operating without the uninterrupted supply chains and heavy manufacturing required to sustain maneuver warfare. Russia's current operational limits are set by hard mathematical constraints and a structural shift in the regional security architecture. To accurately map the constraints operating on the Kremlin, we have to pull back from the Donbass and look at Northern Europe. The accession of Finland and Sweden into NATO, coupled with legislative moves to potentially host nuclear deterrence directly on the Finnish border, instantly erased Russia's strategic depth. Finland's 1,340-kilometer border with Russia hosts a new integrated command architecture, including the deployable CIS module in Riihimäki. This buildup forces a response. Russia is restoring abandoned Soviet-era bases in Karelia, expanding their garrison from 3,000 to a target of 80,000 troops. This creates strategic paralysis. The Kremlin possesses an estimated 20,000 troops in strategic reserve. Committing those remaining forces to Ukraine leaves a massive, nuclear-aligned border entirely undefended. This vulnerability is compounded by massive conventional readiness exercises, like Cold Response 26, which continuously validate the logistical pathways required to rapidly reinforce that exact border. By attempting to secure a buffer state in Ukraine, Moscow paradoxically compromised its own deterrence. The Russian military is now permanently split. Beyond the geographic split, the Russian state is trapped in a macroeconomic crisis that makes rapid force generation financially impossible. Russia's 2026 planned federal deficit was roughly $50 billion. By the first quarter, it reached $61 billion. To sustain operations amidst this hemorrhage, the state drained its sovereign wealth fund's liquid reserves, forcing the liquidation of physical gold. Internally, the civilian economy is collapsing. An extremely low unemployment rate masks a severe labor starvation. The civilian workforce has been extracted and pushed into the defense industry or the trenches. Simultaneously, Ukraine has institutionalized a strike campaign specifically targeting Russian oil refineries, Caspian Sea drilling platforms, and logistics networks, strangling the state's primary mechanism of financial leverage. This is exactly why a massive second mobilization is unlikely. Drafting more personnel would empty the factories required to produce the artillery shells and body armor needed to equip them. The Russian state lacks the economic currency to fund a prolonged, war-winning sweep. They are cannibalizing their future to buy time in the present. Moving from the macroeconomy back down to the tactical front lines, the physical constraints preventing a mechanized breakthrough become clear. The massing of conventional forces relies on operational surprise. Today, continuous drone coverage and real-time satellite imagery mean any concentration of armor is instantly detected and engaged by long-range precision fires, long before reaching the line of contact. Operating heavy armor in this fully transparent environment has cost the Russian military an estimated 80% of its pre-war main battle tank fleet. Visual intelligence confirms the loss of over 23,000 Russian vehicles. Set against this, their industry delivers merely 35 replacement tanks per month. Because production and deep storage restoration cannot compensate for attrition, Russian commanders were forced to park remaining armor to preserve a strategic reserve. Stripped of armored protection, the military has regressed tactically. They are compelled to rely on highly dispersed assault groups, slowly feeding troops across the kill web on foot. Russia lacks the protected mobility required to move forces under fire. In 2026, launching a massed combined arms offensive is functionally suicidal. While Russia regresses to dismounted infantry, Ukraine has engineered a massive technological response, the deployment of 25,000 unmanned ground vehicles in the first half of 2026. Driven by the Brave 1 cluster, Ukraine established a mandate to transition 100% of frontline logistics, resupply, and casualty evacuation to robotic platforms, insulating soldiers from kinetic exposure in the last mile. Acknowledging their inability to win a ground war of maneuver, the Russian command structure has pivoted heavily to an aerospace strategy, defined as qualitative saturation. This diagrams a multi-vector strike cross-section. Russia layers hundreds of strike drones with supersonic missiles and hypersonic glide vehicles. The objective is to overwhelm interceptor allocation logic. Presenting threats of vastly different velocities and radar cross-sections specifically compresses the defensive decision cycle. This aerial strategy relies on continuous technological adaptation, heavily prioritizing dynamic targeting modifications, such as illicitly mounting commercial satellite communication links directly onto long-range strike drones. The integration of these platforms accelerates a shift toward algorithmic war, where autonomous logistics and remote engagement dictate the physical survival of frontline units. Strategic analysis demands rigorous candor regarding Allied vulnerabilities. If we adopt a red team perspective, we can identify a single cataclysmic point of failure within Ukraine's new automated advantage. The asymmetric strength of 25,000 autonomous vehicles introduces massive systemic risk. The frontline architecture is now dependent on continuous digital infrastructure and mesh networking. The supply chain supporting this fleet comprises over 280 distinct defense tech startups. While innovative, these entities may lack the rigorous cybersecurity architecture required to repel state-level actors. This node network illustrates the threat. A cascading ransomware-as-a-service attack executed by elite Russian military intelligence cyber units could compromise a single widely shared firmware component and infect the entire ecosystem. If this digital freeze is simultaneously paired with a localized electromagnetic pulse or an intense electronic warfare assault to sever all redundancies, the entire Ukrainian logistical backbone evaporates in hours. The kinetic fallout would be absolute. Ukrainian infantry units would be instantly stranded, cut off from artillery shells, small arms ammunition, and the ability to evacuate casualties under fire. Engineering this temporary digital paralysis represents the only remaining vector for Russian forces to achieve operational shock and drive their remaining reserves through the defensive lines. To neutralize this systemic threat, Allied commands must mandate and enforce severe cybersecurity compliance standards across the entire Ukrainian defense tech supply chain. Over the long term, NATO must institutionalize the northern deterrent. Solidifying the physical and command infrastructure in Finland will continuously divide Russian military focus, forcing Moscow to waste limited resources defending its northwestern border. Economically, Western statecraft must transition from passive sanctions to the active facilitation of infrastructure degradation, enabling the continuous dismantling of Russia's hydrocarbon and rail networks. The ripple effects of this conflict are already clear. The empirical failure of heavy armor in a transparent battle space will force a reallocation of global defense procurement toward autonomous swarms and electronic warfare platforms. Unable to independently recapitalize its destroyed military apparatus, Russia is locked into a trajectory of severe economic and technological dependency, structurally incapable of maintaining independent grand strategy. The conventional Russian offensive is on pace to permanently culminate. It is constrained by algorithmic clarity, geopolitical expansion, and a cannibalized economy, cementing a reality where the destruction of data is as lethal as the destruction of armor.